In December 1945, two brothers were digging for sabak near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt. What they found instead challenged our understanding of early Christianity. Buried in a large jar were 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 separate texts. These weren't copies of books that had been lost. These were complete manuscripts of writings that had been deliberately hidden by church authorities over 1,000 years earlier. The Nag Hammadi texts revealed an entire branch of early Christianity that had been systematically erased from history. These Gnostic Christians believed that salvation came through knowledge rather than faith, that the physical world was created by a lesser deity, and that Jesus came to reveal hidden truths rather than die for humanity's sins. Most shocking of all, several of these texts portrayed women, particularly Mary Magdalene, as key apostles with authority equal to or even greater than the male disciples. The Gospel of Philip, found among the Nag Hammadi texts, describes Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, whom he loved more than all the disciples and kissed often on her mouth. The Gospel of Mary presents her as receiving special revelations that the other apostles didn't understand. These weren't peripheral characters or minor variations on familiar stories. These were fundamental challenges to the male-dominated hierarchy that had controlled Christianity since the 4th century. But here's where the suppression becomes obvious. Despite being discovered in 1945, complete translations of the Nag Hammadi texts weren't available to the public until 1977. 32 years of scholarly study, academic debates, and careful translation work that happened largely behind closed doors. During those decades, only a small group of scholars had access to these revolutionary texts, and much of what they found contradicted everything the Church had taught about early Christianity. The second forbidden discovery involves a gospel that challenges the most fundamental story in Christian theology. The Gospel of Judas presents such a radical reinterpretation of the crucifixion that its very existence threatens core church doctrine. For over 16 centuries, this text existed only in references by church fathers who condemned it as heretical. Then, in the 1970s, the actual manuscript surfaced in Egypt, only to disappear again into the black market antiquities trade. The gospel spent decades changing hands among private collectors and dealers, deteriorating in safety deposit boxes and private collections, while scholars could only guess at its contents. When the Gospel of Judas was finally restored and translated in 2006, its revelations were staggering. Instead of portraying Judas as a traitor who betrayed Jesus for silver, this gospel presents him as Jesus' most trusted disciple, the only one capable of understanding his true mission. According to this text, Jesus specifically asked Judas to hand him over to the authorities because the crucifixion was necessary for Jesus to escape his physical body and return to the divine realm. This interpretation completely undermines the traditional understanding of Jesus' death as a sacrifice for humanity's sins. Instead of dying unwillingly to save mankind, this gospel suggests that Jesus orchestrated his own death to achieve spiritual liberation, and that Judas was not a betrayer, but a faithful servant carrying out his master's final request. The theological implications are staggering. If this gospel reflects authentic early Christian belief, then one of the foundational narratives of Christianity, the story of betrayal and redemption, becomes something entirely different. The Church's emphasis on sin, sacrifice, and salvation through Christ's suffering loses its central meaning if Jesus actually wanted to die and specifically chose Judas to make it happen. Church historians have spent considerable energy discrediting this gospel, arguing that it was written too late to reflect authentic tradition and that it represents the views of a heretical sect rather than mainstream Christianity. But the fact remains that some early Christians believed this version of events, and their beliefs were systematically suppressed and erased from the historical record. The third forbidden discovery reveals that one of the most influential books in Jewish and early Christian literature was deliberately excluded from the Bible despite being quoted by New Testament authors. The Book of Enoch contains prophecies, visions, and revelations that were too dangerous for church authorities to allow in the official canon. The Book of Enoch was enormously popular in ancient Jewish and early Christian communities. The letter of Jude in the New Testament directly quotes from Enoch, treating it as authoritative scripture. Early church fathers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus considered it genuine prophecy. Fragments of the text were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving that it was studied and preserved by Jewish communities right up until the time of Jesus. But by the 4th century, when church councils were determining which books would be included in the official Bible, the Book of Enoch had become problematic. The text contains detailed accounts of fallen angels who descended to earth, taught forbidden knowledge to humanity, and corrupted the world through their interactions with human women. These fallen angels, called Watchers, revealed secrets of metallurgy, astronomy, magic, and warfare that were supposed to remain hidden from mankind. According to Enoch's visions, these angelic rebellions led directly to the corruption that necessitated the Great Flood. The text describes a complex hierarchy of angels, detailed prophecies about the end times, and revelations about the nature of heaven and hell that went far beyond anything in the canonical scriptures. Most disturbing to church authorities, the Book of Enoch suggested that evil in the world came not from human sin alone, but from cosmic rebellion that began in the divine realm itself. The exclusion of Enoch from the biblical canon wasn't based on questions about its authenticity or early acceptance. The book was excluded because its teachings about fallen angels, cosmic rebellion, and forbidden knowledge were too complex and potentially dangerous for ordinary believers. Church authorities preferred a simpler narrative where evil entered the world through human disobedience rather than divine corruption. Even today, most Christian denominations reject the Book of Enoch, despite its obvious influence on biblical authors and early Christian thought. The text remains canonical only in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has preserved complete manuscripts when all other Christian traditions abandoned it. The systematic exclusion of Enochic literature represents one of the most successful examples of theological suppression in church history. The fourth forbidden discovery involves archaeological evidence that was kept from public view for over 40 years because it revealed inconvenient truths about biblical history. The Dead Sea Scrolls represent the most significant archaeological find of the 20th century. But access to these ancient texts was controlled by a small group of scholars who delayed publication and restricted research that might challenge orthodox interpretations. Between 1947 and 1956, Bedouin shepherds and archaeologists discovered nearly 900 manuscripts hidden in caves near the Dead Sea. These texts, preserved in the dry desert climate for over 2,000 years, included the oldest known copies of biblical books, previously unknown religious writings, and sectarian documents that revealed the diversity of Jewish thought during the time of Jesus. But instead of being made immediately available to scholars worldwide, the Dead Sea Scrolls were placed under the control of a small international team led by Father Roland DeVoe, a Dominican priest who ensured that Catholic scholars dominated the research. For decades, only 8 scholars had access to the unpublished scrolls, and they maintained strict control over who could study the texts and what could be published about their contents. The delays were extraordinary. Of over 800 manuscripts discovered, only about 100 had been published by 1985, nearly 40 years after the initial discoveries. Scholars outside the inner circle were denied access not only to the original manuscripts but even to photographs of the texts. When researchers requested permission to study specific documents, they were often told that the materials were too fragile or that publication was pending, sometimes for decades. The suppression became so obvious that it sparked international academic controversy. Biblical scholars around the world accused the scroll team of deliberately restricting access to protect Catholic doctrine from potentially damaging revelations. The monopoly was finally broken in 1991 when unauthorized photographs of unpublished texts were released, forcing complete publication of the entire collection. What was so dangerous about these ancient texts that justified 4 decades of restricted access? The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that Judaism during the Second Temple period was far more diverse and complex than traditional scholarship had acknowledged. They contained prophecies, messianic expectations, and religious practices that didn't match either modern Judaism or early Christianity. Most significantly, they showed that the Jewish community that preserved these texts had developed theological ideas that would later appear in Christianity, suggesting that Jesus' teachings were rooted in existing Jewish traditions rather than representing entirely new revelations. The fifth forbidden discovery involves a text so controversial that its very existence remained hidden until fragments were accidentally rediscovered in an ancient garbage dump. The first apocalypse of James presents Jesus delivering secret teachings to his brother James. Revelations that church authorities considered so heretical they tried to erase every copy from existence. In the late 1800s, archaeologists excavating the ancient Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus were sifting through what appeared to be an ordinary refuse heap filled with tax receipts and commercial documents. Among the mundane paperwork, they discovered fragments of a text that shouldn't have existed. Written in Coptic on deteriorating papyrus, these fragments contain teachings supposedly given by Jesus to his brother James after the resurrection, instructions about ascending to higher spiritual realms and achieving divine knowledge. What made this discovery extraordinary wasn't just the content, but the evidence of how the text had been used. Small dots marked throughout the manuscript indicated that this had been a teaching document used by early Christian communities to instruct believers in what they considered authentic apostolic tradition. This wasn't some obscure theological treatise written by later heretics. This was a practical manual for Christian instruction that had been actively suppressed. The first apocalypse of James belongs to a category of early Christian literature that emphasized personal spiritual transformation through hidden knowledge. According to this text, Jesus revealed to James secret information about the nature of reality, the structure of the divine realm, and methods for achieving spiritual ascension after death. These teachings contradicted the emerging orthodox position that salvation came through faith in Christ's atoning sacrifice, rather than through mystical knowledge and personal spiritual development. Church fathers like Irenaeus specifically condemned texts like the first apocalypse of James because they promoted what he called false gnosis, or false knowledge. The concern wasn't that these texts were obviously fraudulent, but that they presented compelling alternative interpretations of Christian teaching that could lead believers away from church authority and toward individual spiritual seeking. The systematic destruction of these texts was so thorough that scholars assumed the first apocalypse of James had been completely lost until the Oxyrhynchus fragments proved that copies had survived into at least the 4th or 5th centuries. The fact that it was being used as a teaching tool suggests that some Christian communities continued to value these forbidden writings long after church authorities had declared them heretical. The sixth forbidden discovery reveals how church authorities manipulated biblical manuscripts to support their theological agenda. Hidden beneath later texts in ancient palimpsests, scholars have found evidence of earlier gospel traditions that were deliberately overwritten to eliminate inconvenient variations in the story of Jesus. A palimpsest is a manuscript where the original text has been scraped or washed off, so the expensive parchment can be reused for new writing. For centuries, these recycled manuscripts were treated as ordinary documents, containing only the visible surface text. But modern technology has revealed that many palimpsests contain hidden layers of earlier writing that can be recovered using ultraviolet photography and digital imaging techniques. In recent years, these technological advances have uncovered disturbing evidence of systematic textual suppression. Ancient gospel manuscripts that contained variations in key stories about Jesus were deliberately destroyed by scraping off the original text and writing over it with approved versions. The hidden texts reveal alternative readings of familiar passages, different accounts of Jesus' teachings, and variations in the resurrection narrative that didn't align with developing Orthodox doctrine. One of the most significant discoveries came from examining a palimpsest preserved in the Vatican Library. Using advanced imaging techniques, scholars revealed an underlying text that contained a previously unknown version of the Gospels written in Old Syriac, one of the earliest languages used for Christian manuscripts. This hidden Gospel contained readings that differed substantially from the Greek texts that became the basis for modern Bible translations. The variations weren't minor differences in wording or translation. The hidden text contained entire passages that had been removed from later versions, alternative accounts of Jesus' genealogy, and different versions of his final words on the cross. Most significantly, the earlier text presented a version of Christianity that emphasized Jesus as a teacher and prophet, rather than as the divine Son of God who died for humanity's sins. The deliberate overwriting of these manuscripts represents direct evidence that church authorities were actively suppressing textual traditions that didn't support their theological positions. Rather than preserving the diversity of early Christian writing, they were systematically eliminating alternatives and ensuring that only approved versions would survive for future generations. The seventh forbidden discovery involves a gospel that presents such a radical vision of women's spiritual authority that its suppression helped establish the male-dominated church hierarchy that persists today. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene reveals that early Christian communities included women in leadership roles that were later systematically erased from church history. The complete text of the Gospel of Mary wasn't discovered until 1896, when scholars acquired a 5th century Coptic manuscript from an antiquities dealer in Egypt. Even then, the text remained largely unknown outside academic circles for decades. When translations finally became available, they revealed a gospel that portrayed Mary Magdalene not as a repentant prostitute or devoted follower, but as a leading apostle with spiritual authority that exceeded that of the male disciples. According to the Gospel of Mary, Jesus gave her special revelations about the nature of sin, the soul's journey after death, and the path to spiritual enlightenment. When Mary shared these teachings with the other disciples, Peter and Andrew questioned her authority, asking whether Jesus would really have given secret teachings to a woman rather than to them. Mary's response reveals the gender tensions that existed in early Christian communities and the resistance that women faced when claiming spiritual leadership. The Gospel presents a version of early Christianity where women served as teachers, visionaries, and community leaders. Mary Magdalene appears not as a supporting character in the Jesus story, but as a primary interpreter of his teachings who possessed spiritual insights that the male apostles lacked. Her Gospel contains sophisticated theological discussions about the nature of matter and spirit, the origin of sin, and the process of spiritual transformation that demonstrate advanced religious thinking. Church authorities suppressed the Gospel of Mary because it challenged the emerging consensus that women should be excluded from positions of religious authority. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, church leaders had systematically eliminated women from leadership roles and established a male-only priesthood. Texts like the Gospel of Mary provided inconvenient evidence that this hierarchical structure wasn't part of Jesus' original teaching, but was a later development imposed by church authorities. The suppression of women's Gospels like Mary's was part of a broader effort to rewrite early Christian history and eliminate evidence of female spiritual leadership. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine argued that women were naturally inferior and couldn't be trusted with religious authority, but they had to actively suppress textual evidence that contradicted this position. The 8th forbidden discovery involves evidence that the New Testament itself underwent extensive editing and revision to remove teachings that didn't align with developing church doctrine. Hidden in ancient manuscripts are traces of original readings that were systematically altered to support orthodox theological positions. Modern biblical scholarship has revealed that the New Testament texts we possess today differ substantially from the earliest manuscripts. Through careful comparison of ancient copies, scholars have identified thousands of variations in the text, ranging from minor spelling differences to substantial changes in meaning. While most of these variations are indeed minor, some represent deliberate theological editing designed to support specific doctrinal positions. One of the most significant examples involves the ending of Mark's Gospel. The earliest manuscripts end abruptly with the women fleeing from the empty tomb in fear, but later copies add resurrection appearances and a commission to preach the gospel to all nations. This longer ending, which appears in most modern Bible translations, wasn't part of the original text, but was added by later scribes who felt that Mark's Gospel needed a more satisfying conclusion. Similar theological editing appears throughout the New Testament. Passages that could be interpreted as supporting adoptionist Christology, the belief that Jesus became divine at his baptism rather than being born divine, were systematically altered to support the orthodox position that Jesus was always fully divine. References to Jesus experiencing human emotions like anger or uncertainty were softened or removed to preserve his divine dignity. The most extensive editing appears in passages related to church authority and women's roles. Early manuscripts contain references to women serving as deacons, apostles, and church leaders, but later copies often change these references to male forms or add qualifying statements that limit women's authority. The famous passage in 1 Timothy, instructing women to remain silent in churches, appears to be a later addition that wasn't part of the original text. This systematic editing of biblical manuscripts represents a form of theological censorship that continued for centuries after the New Testament was written. Church authorities didn't just suppress alternative gospels and heretical texts. They actively modified the canonical scriptures themselves to ensure that the Bible supported orthodox doctrine and church hierarchy. The ninth forbidden discovery reveals that some of the most important early Christian writings were hidden not by ancient church authorities, but by modern scholars who feared their implications for contemporary faith. Recent archaeological finds have been deliberately kept from public attention, while researchers debate how to present discoveries that challenge fundamental Christian beliefs. In the past several decades, archaeological excavations throughout the Middle East have uncovered numerous Christian sites, manuscripts, and artifacts that provide new insights into early church history. However, many of these discoveries remain unpublished or have been presented in ways that minimize their more controversial implications. Academic politics, religious sensitivities, and concerns about public reaction have created a new form of suppression that operates through scholarly gatekeeping rather than official church censorship. One significant example involves early Christian sites in Jordan and Syria that contain inscriptions and artwork depicting a form of Christianity that differed substantially from later Orthodox tradition. These archaeological remains show Christian communities that incorporated elements from local religious traditions, practiced different forms of worship, and held theological beliefs that would later be condemned as heretical. However, excavation reports often downplay these differences or interpret them as evidence of syncretism rather than authentic alternative Christian traditions. Similarly, manuscript discoveries from monastery libraries in Egypt and Ethiopia have revealed texts that present different accounts of early church history, alternative versions of familiar stories, and theological positions that challenge orthodox doctrine. While these manuscripts are studied by scholars, their more controversial contents are often buried in academic publications that receive little public attention. The modern suppression operates through several mechanisms. Controversial discoveries are published in specialized academic journals with limited circulation. Alternative interpretations are dismissed as fringe scholarship or relegated to footnotes. Translations emphasize readings that align with orthodox tradition while downplaying alternatives. And media coverage focuses on discoveries that support traditional Christian beliefs while ignoring finds that raise difficult questions. This contemporary form of suppression is more subtle than ancient book burning, but it's equally effective at controlling public understanding of early Christian history. By limiting access to controversial discoveries and shaping how they're interpreted, Modern scholars and religious authorities maintain the same kind of theological control that ancient church fathers exercised through direct censorship. Authorship. The 10th forbidden discovery involves a collection of texts so revolutionary that their existence has been systematically denied by church authorities for over 15 centuries. The secret Gospel of Mark contains passages that were allegedly removed from the canonical Gospel because they described initiation rituals and mystical practices that early church leaders considered too dangerous for ordinary believers. In 1958, Columbia University professor Morton Smith was cataloguing manuscripts at the Mar Saba monastery near Jerusalem when he discovered something extraordinary. Hidden inside the back cover of a 17th century book was a letter copied in 18th century handwriting. The letter, supposedly written by Clement of Alexandria around 200 CE, discussed a secret version of Mark's Gospel that contained additional episodes not found in the canonical text. According to Clement's letter, Mark had written 2 versions of his Gospel. The first was the public version that became part of the New Testament. The second was a more spiritual Gospel containing advanced teachings intended only for those being initiated into the deeper mysteries of the Christian faith. This secret Gospel reportedly included a story about Jesus raising a young man from the dead, after which the man came to Jesus at night wearing only a linen cloth to receive instruction in the mystery of the kingdom of God. The implications were staggering. If authentic, this letter proved that the early church had deliberately hidden portions of Jesus' teachings from ordinary believers, creating a 2-tiered system where esoteric knowledge was reserved for spiritual elites. The secret gospel passages suggested that Christianity originally included mystical initiation practices similar to those found in Greek mystery religions, practices that were later suppressed in favor of simpler faith-based approaches. But here's where the suppression becomes obvious. Despite Smith's discovery being published in academic journals and presented at scholarly conferences, the original manuscript disappeared back into the monastery's collection and has never been independently examined. Requests to study the document have been denied, and monastery officials claim they cannot locate the text that Smith photographed. Without access to the original manuscript, scholars cannot verify its authenticity using modern testing methods. The controversy surrounding Secret Mark reveals how modern suppression operates. Rather than burning books or issuing official condemnations, contemporary authorities simply restrict access and allow doubt to undermine controversial discoveries. By keeping the manuscript hidden, church officials ensure that questions about its authenticity prevent serious consideration of its theological implications. Even if Secret Mark proves to be authentic, its existence demonstrates that early Christian communities preserved traditions about Jesus that were deliberately excluded from public teaching. The systematic removal of mystical and esoteric elements from Christianity represents one of the most successful theological suppressions in history, transforming a complex spiritual tradition into a simplified religious system that emphasized obedience over enlightenment. These 10 forbidden discoveries reveal a pattern that extends far beyond individual texts or archaeological finds. They demonstrate that the Christianity we know today is the result of centuries of systematic suppression, careful editing, and deliberate exclusion of alternative traditions. The version of Christian history taught in churches and seminaries represents just one strand of a much more complex and diverse early movement. What makes these suppressions particularly disturbing is their continuation into the modern era. While ancient church fathers burned heretical books and persecuted alternative teachers, contemporary authorities use more subtle methods. Academic gatekeeping restricts access to controversial discoveries. Publication delays prevent public awareness of challenging finds. And scholarly debates about authenticity create enough doubt to dismiss inconvenient evidence. The cumulative effect of these suppressions has been to create a sanitized version of Christian origins that bears little resemblance to the actual historical reality. Early Christianity wasn't the unified movement that church historians describe. It was a diverse collection of communities with competing interpretations of Jesus' message, different practices, and conflicting theological positions. Women served as leaders, teachers, and visionaries. Mystical practices were common, and the boundaries between Christianity and other religious traditions were much more fluid than Orthodox accounts suggest. Perhaps most significantly, these forbidden discoveries reveal that the version of Christianity that survived and became Orthodox wasn't necessarily more authentic or true than the alternatives that were suppressed. It was simply the interpretation that had better political connections, more institutional support, and greater willingness to use force against its competitors. The councils that determined biblical canon weren't guided purely by spiritual discernment. They were political gatherings where theological positions were decided through negotiation, compromise, and power struggles. The systematic suppression of alternative Christian traditions has had profound consequences that extend far beyond academic debates about ancient texts. By eliminating evidence of women's spiritual leadership, church authorities establish patriarchal structures that persist today. By removing mystical and esoteric teachings, they created a religious system that emphasizes external authority over internal spiritual development. And by suppressing texts that presented different accounts of Jesus' message, they prevented believers from accessing the full diversity of early Christian thought. Understanding these forbidden discoveries doesn't require abandoning faith or rejecting Christianity entirely. Instead, it demands a more honest acknowledgement of how religious traditions develop over time, through human decisions rather than divine mandate. The texts and traditions that were suppressed weren't necessarily wrong or dangerous. They were simply different, and difference was perceived as threat by authorities who preferred uniformity and control. The modern rediscovery of these forbidden texts offers an opportunity to reclaim the diversity and complexity that characterized early Christianity before it was systematized and controlled by institutional authorities. Rather than seeing these discoveries as threats to faith, believers can view them as invitations to explore the rich variety of ways that ancient Christians understood and practiced their religion. The story of these 10 forbidden discoveries ultimately reveals that religious truth is far more complex and multifaceted than any single institution wants to admit. The systematic suppression of alternative traditions represents not the protection of divine truth, but the human desire to control spiritual understanding and maintain institutional power. By bringing these hidden texts back into the light, we reclaim the right to explore the full spectrum of human spiritual experience and discover for ourselves what these ancient voices have to teach us about faith, meaning, and the divine mystery that connects us all. These discoveries force us to confront the most fundamental question about religious authority. If church leaders were willing to suppress, edit, and destroy texts that challenged their interpretations, what does that say about the reliability of the traditions they preserved? The pattern we've explored isn't just about ancient manuscripts or archaeological finds. It's about the systematic construction of religious orthodoxy through the elimination of alternatives. What makes this suppression even more disturbing is how effectively it worked. For over 15 centuries, most Christians had no idea that alternative gospels existed, that women had served as apostles, or that early Christian communities practiced mystical initiation rites. The church didn't just win the theological debates of the 4th and 5th centuries. They erased the evidence that those debates had ever taken place. Modern believers inherit a religious tradition that presents itself as unchanged since apostolic times. But these forbidden discoveries reveal a completely different reality. The Christianity that emerged from the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople wasn't the inevitable result of spiritual truth triumphing over error. It was the outcome of political maneuvering, institutional power struggles, and systematic suppression of alternatives. Consider what this means for contemporary faith. Every time you hear a sermon about the role of women in the church, Remember that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene portrayed her as Jesus' primary interpreter and spiritual authority. Every time someone quotes Paul's instructions for women to remain silent, remember that those passages appear to be later additions designed to support patriarchal church structure. Every time church leaders claim exclusive authority to interpret Scripture, remember that early Christian communities valued personal revelation and mystical experience over institutional control. The suppression continues today through more sophisticated mechanisms. Academic conferences where controversial discoveries are discussed happen behind closed doors. Scholarly journals that publish challenging research have limited circulation among general believers. Popular Christian media focuses on archaeological finds that support traditional narratives while ignoring discoveries that raise difficult questions. And religious education systems teach simplified versions of church history that omit the diversity and conflict that characterized early Christianity. But perhaps the most effective modern suppression happens through interpretation rather than censorship. When the Gospel of Thomas is mentioned at all in Christian education, it's dismissed as late, Gnostic, and irrelevant. When the Dead Sea Scrolls are discussed, emphasis is placed on how they support the reliability of biblical transmission rather than how they reveal the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. When women's leadership in early Christianity is acknowledged, it's minimized as exceptional cases rather than evidence of broader patterns. This interpretive suppression allows church authorities to acknowledge the existence of these forbidden discoveries while neutralizing their challenging implications. They can claim transparency while maintaining theological control. They can appear scholarly while preserving institutional authority. And they can satisfy academic critics while keeping ordinary believers unaware of how radically these discoveries challenge traditional Christian narratives. The cumulative effect has been to create a religious system that bears little resemblance to the diverse, mystical, and often chaotic movement that characterized early Christianity. Instead of communities where prophets, teachers, and visionaries of all genders shared spiritual insights, we have hierarchical institutions dominated by male clergy. Instead of traditions that emphasize personal spiritual transformation through hidden knowledge, we have simplified belief systems focused on doctrinal compliance. Instead of fluid boundaries between Christianity and other spiritual traditions, we have rigid orthodoxies that define themselves through exclusion and opposition. These 10 forbidden discoveries reveal the true cost of religious orthodoxy. Early Christianity wasn't the unified faith we've been taught to believe. It was a revolutionary movement where women taught alongside men, where mystical knowledge competed with institutional authority, and where diverse communities interpreted Jesus' message in radically different ways. The church didn't preserve divine truth through the centuries. It constructed a sanitized version of history by systematically destroying alternatives. Today, these hidden texts emerge from desert sands and monastery libraries like buried time capsules, offering glimpses of the rich spiritual diversity that once flourished before authority demanded conformity. The question isn't whether these discoveries threaten faith. The question is whether we have the courage to explore what they reveal about the human quest for divine truth.